Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something, well, genuinely revolutionary. It's an idea that really challenges the foundations of how we think about mental health and healing. We're diving into a new framework, a new approach called the Unity Method. Now, if the therapy most of us know, let's call it Therapy 1.0, tends to start by asking, what's wrong with you? What's broken? Well, the Unity Method flips that entirely. It's Therapy 2.0, and it starts from a fundamentally different place, a conviction. You are whole. You've endured things, yes, but you are fundamentally whole. So our mission today is pretty bold. Think of this as a pitch directly to you, our listener. We're going to unpack exactly what the Unity Method is. We'll show you why its creators argue it's, frankly, a necessary evolution from current models. And we want to describe how this is meant to spark something bigger, a movement, really aimed at changing the whole conversation. Moving away from this language of brokenness towards recognizing our innate human capacity for healing.
Yeah, and we've been digging into the source material for this, a pretty detailed prospectus. It lays out the clinical thinking, the philosophical roots, and really importantly, the evidence they project for why this method could be more effective than what's widely used now. The core argument hits on something quite profound, maybe even a bit painful to acknowledge, which is that the current system, even with the best intentions, can often end up reinforcing what the creators call this crisis of brokenness as identity.
Brokenness as identity, well.
Exactly. And Unity tries to counteract that directly. It's built on this really restorative idea, this conviction that challenges, decades of practice. It starts with this declaration: you are not broken. You are a human being shaped by your story. You do not need fixing. You need space, support, and tools to remember who you are.
Yeah.
That statement. That's the core shift. It's the foundation Unity uses to try and redefine the whole experience of seeking help.
Okay, so let's start there. With the diagnosis, if you will, of the current system, Therapy 1.0, why do these traditional models, even unintentionally, sometimes end up fostering hopelessness or reinforcing stigma? Where does that begin?
Well, according to the Unity Framework's critique, it really starts with the basic tools. The bedrock of modern psychology for diagnosis and understanding has been the pathology-first model. Primarily, we're talking about the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, and similar systems like the ICD used internationally.
Right, the big books of label.
Big books. And it's crucial to be fair here. These manuals did something essential initially. They standardized the language. That allowed researchers to actually study these conditions systematically, compare results, build knowledge. That's huge. And pragmatically, they provided the codes needed for insurance, for billing. That helped legitimize mental health care, get it recognized as a serious field.
Okay, so necessary for research, necessary for the system to function administratively. But the argument is there was a hidden cost for the person seeking help.
That's precisely the argument. The DSM, you could say, became a sort of necessary evil in this view. While having a label can be validating initially, okay, this thing I'm experiencing has a name, it also, unintentionally, helped solidify an identity based on defect. Just think about the language shift you often hear, maybe even in yourself or people you know. Someone stops saying, lately I've been having symptoms of depression, and they start saying, I am depressed, or I am anxious, I am borderline.
Yeah, I see that. It goes from describing a temporary state, like having the flu, to defining who you are, like having brown eyes.
That's it. That is the subtle but incredibly destructive linguistic shift that Unity aims to dismantle. From, I have a disorder, which describes something you're experiencing, to, I am a disorder, which defines your core being. It changes something that might be temporary, something shaped by your life, your environment, your experiences, into this seemingly permanent, fixed trait.
Like a life sentence.
It creates a psychological cage, exactly. You start to internalize that label, and that profoundly shapes how you see your future, your potential. And very often it leads to this deep internalized shame.
And I guess that feeling, that internalization, feeds right into the next problem they identify, this idea of permanence, of determinism. Like, once you believe, I am this, you assume it's forever.
Precisely. Traditional models, especially when they lean heavily on a biological or psychiatric interpretation, can sometimes slip into a kind of genetic determinism. You hear narratives like, oh, it's in your genes, your father had it, you have it, it's your brain chemistry, it's fixed.
Right, it's written in your DNA.
Exactly. And that kind of fixed fate story is just devastating.
Yeah.
Because it flies in the face of what we now know is arguably the most hopeful discovery in neuroscience in the last 50 years, neuroplasticity.
The brain's incredible ability to change, to rewire itself based on experience, learning, healing.
Yes. It's constantly adapting. But if you're consistently told, implicitly or explicitly, that your condition is fixed, it's genetic, it's permanent,
Hmm.
well, the logical conclusion is, okay, I guess I'll always be broken. This diagnosis is forever.
And that leads to disengagement.
It fosters hopelessness, absolutely. And it makes it harder to fully engage in the hard work of therapy. The source material pointed to research, like work by Corrigan on self-stigma. It shows that when people internalize these diagnostic labels, they tend to have lower self-efficacy, less belief in their own ability to cope or change, they experience more shame, and crucially, they're often less likely to stick with treatment long-term. Why pour your heart and soul into changing if the system itself implies you're fundamentally permanently damaged?
It makes sense. And we also see this pathology first idea reflected in just how many different kinds of therapy there are, right? Dozens of modalities, CBT, DBT, IFS, psychodynamic, they're all different. But Unity argues they share a starting point.
They do, largely. That's another key point in the critique. The field is incredibly fragmented, you're right. You've got all these different schools of thought, different techniques. But look underneath the surface, and the Unity perspective argues that almost all of them, historically, start from the same basic assumption. Therapy begins by identifying and targeting what's wrong, what's the deficit, what's the dysfunction.
So Freud's looking for unconscious conflicts.
Right. Behaviorists are looking for maladaptive learned responses.
Cognitive therapists are looking for distorted thoughts.
Exactly. The starting point is almost always the flaw, the problem, the pathology.
And then you layer on top of that the huge influence of pharmaceuticals.
Which often reinforces that broken brain medical model, doesn't it? Your brain chemistry is off balance. You need this pill to correct it. Now again, medication can be absolutely vital, life-saving, especially in acute situations. No one's denying that. But the dominance of that narrative, the Unity folks argue, can overshadow the brain's and the body's own incredible capacity to heal and re-regulate through things like relationships, somatic work, changing your environment.
So the real crisis isn't just more people having symptoms.
The argument is the deeper crisis is the widespread cultural acceptance, almost normalization, of brokenness as a fundamental part of identity for people struggling. That's the unintended legacy of Therapy 1.0 that Unity wants to directly challenge and change.
Okay, that paints a really clear picture of the problem Unity is trying to solve. So if Therapy 1.0 asks, what's wrong with you? Let's unpack the alternative. How does this Unity method, with its principle of inherent wholeness, actually redefine the whole therapeutic journey from the start?
It's a complete paradigm shift. It's not just tweaking techniques. It's changing the fundamental understanding of what it means to struggle, what it means to heal. The core principle insists right from the outset that every single human being is inherently whole. Full stop. Yes, people experience immense pain. Yes, they develop patterns of behavior that cause suffering for themselves or others. Those are absolutely real. But in the Unity view, these patterns, this pain, they are temporary states, they are adaptations. They are not defects in the core self. They don't define your identity.
So that capacity to heal, to grow, to adapt, it's always there, even if it feels buried under layers of pain or trauma.
Always. It might be obscured, it might be hard to access, but it's considered an innate part of being human. The therapy then becomes about remembering and reconnecting with that wholeness, not fixing a fundamental flaw.
Okay, so this changes how we view those difficult behaviors or feelings, right? Things like intense anger or shutting down completely or chronic anxiety. If they aren't defects, what are they in this model?
They're reframed as survival strategies. Brilliant ones, actually. Strategies that were likely essential, incredibly useful at some point in your past. But maybe they've outlived their original context.
So not pathology, but past solutions.
Exactly. They're not signs that you're broken. They're evidence of your resilience, your intelligence, your system's desperate attempt to cope and survive under difficult circumstances. Instead of judging the strategy, Unity asks the therapist, and eventually the client, to first honor the intelligence behind it. Why did this pattern make sense then?
Let's make that really concrete. The source material used some powerful examples to show this reframing in action. Can you walk us through how Unity might view anxiety, depression, and even something really stigmatized like borderline traits differently?
Absolutely. These comparisons really highlight the shift. Let's take anxiety first, so incredibly common. The traditional pathology lens, often informed by the DSM criteria for something like generalized anxiety disorder, might see it as, catastrophic thinking, excessive worry, maybe a failure of the brain's higher functions to regulate fear. The language itself implies something is wrong, irrational.
Like your brain's broken.
Right. Unity, however, looks at that same experience and reframes it as overpreparedness. It sees a nervous system that learned, maybe very early in life, perhaps even before verbal memory, that anticipating danger was crucial for survival.
Like if you grew up in a chaotic or unpredictable home.
Exactly. Hypervigilance wasn't irrational then. It was a necessary, brilliant adaptation to stay safe, physically or emotionally. So the therapist starts by validating that historical necessity. Wow, look how incredibly prepared your system learned to be. That kept you safe. Then, the work becomes about helping the client's nervous system learn, deep down, that the current environment right now is actually safe, and that constant level of high alert might not be needed anymore.
That sounds so much less shaming. It's validating the experience rather than labeling it as a flaw.
Precisely. It changes the internal relationship to the feeling. Okay, next, let's look at depression. Again, the traditional view might frame it as hopelessness, learned helplessness, maybe connected to neurotransmitter imbalances like low serotonin. Unity proposes seeing depression, particularly the kind involving shutdown and numbness, as a highly intelligent adaptive state. Think of it as survival conservation.
How so?
Well, in the animal kingdom and in humans, when faced with an overwhelming threat you can't fight or flee from, the nervous system can go into a freeze or shutdown response. It conserves precious energy. It might make you less noticeable. It's a deep, primitive survival mechanism.
So the flatness, the lack of motivation, the withdrawal, that could be seen as the body trying to protect itself when things felt inescapable.
That's the reframe. That shutdown response, that heavy blanket, had a profound wisdom in the context where it arose. Unity asks us to honor that protective function first. Then the therapy isn't about fighting hopelessness. It's more about gently, safely inviting the system back into engagement, back into aliveness, now that the perceived threat level has changed. It's about relearning safety and connection.
Okay. And what about those really intense relational patterns, the ones often labeled as borderline personality disorder? How does Unity approach that without using terms like instability?
This is where the reframe feels particularly radical and potentially deeply healing, given the stigma. The pathology model often uses terms like emotional instability, identity disturbance, splitting, sometimes even manipulation. These words carry a heavy weight of judgment.
Yeah, they sound like character flaws.
They do. Unity, instead, reframes these intense relational dynamics as the absolute brilliance of fighting for connection and love with every fiber of one's being. Often, individuals carrying these labels experienced profound early attachment disruptions, maybe inconsistency, neglect, abandonment, perhaps engulfment. Safe, reliable connection was missing or threatening.
So the intense emotions, the push-pull, it's not inherent instability.
It's seen as a highly activated, often desperate attempt to get fundamental attachment needs met, to secure connection, and to avoid what feels like annihilation, whether that's emotional or physical abandonment. These aren't pathological traits. They are deeply ingrained survival strategies for navigating relationships, learned in an environment where safe relating wasn't possible. They're the only way the person's dysregulated nervous system learned how to try and connect.
Wow. So when the therapist sees it through that wholeness lens, as you called it, the client feels understood for their effort, not judged for the maybe messy outcome.
Exactly. Seen for the desperate striving underneath the behavior. That shifting perspective from the therapist can be profoundly reparative in itself.
So the goal isn't just managing symptoms, it's helping the client rediscover that sense of innate wholeness. What are the core questions that guide a Unity therapist then, if it's not what's wrong with you?
The questions completely reorient the process. They focus on context, adaptation, and inherent capacity. They typically follow this kind of arc. First, what happened to you? This immediately validates the person's experience and acknowledges the impact of their history. It's not about blame, but about understanding context.
Okay.
Second, how has it shaped your present? This connects the past experiences to the current strategies, framing them as understandable adaptations, not random dysfunctions.
Makes sense.
Third, what capacities, what strengths remain unrecognized within these patterns? This actively looks for the hidden resilience, the intelligence, the parts of the self that are still whole, even within the struggle.
Finding the brilliance in the adaptation.
Yes. And finally, how can we work together to reconnect you with your innate wholeness? This sets the therapeutic goal clearly on restoration, empowerment, and agency, not just symptom reduction.
It definitely sounds like it has roots in humanistic psychology, Carl Rogers, Maslow, that emphasis on inherent worth. Is Unity just sort of rebranding that, or is there something genuinely new here?
That's a fair question. It absolutely stands in continuity with that humanistic tradition. Rogers and Maslow were trailblazers, insisting that people aren't just bundles of drives or conditioned responses, but have this inherent drive towards growth and self-actualization. Huge contribution. But historically, classical humanistic psychology sometimes struggled a bit with maybe empirical validation in the way modern science demands it. And sometimes it lacked the really specific tools needed to work effectively with severe, complex trauma stored deep in the nervous system.
So it had the philosophy, but maybe not always the detailed map for the deepest wounds.
You could put it that way. Unity sees itself as the evolution of that lineage. It takes that profound respect for human dignity, that insistence on inherent worth, and it marries it directly with the hard science of the 21st century, particularly neuroscience and our understanding of the body. It aims to provide both the philosophical foundation and the specific science-backed techniques to make that potential for wholeness a lived reality, even after significant adversity. It's humanism with neurobiological teeth, if you will.
Humanism with neurobiological teeth. I like that. Okay, so this philosophy, this reframing, it sounds incredibly appealing, very hopeful, but now we need to get into the how. For the listener who's thinking, okay, fine, but how does feeling whole actually change anything deep down? Where's the science? How did this translate into real, measurable change, maybe even more effectively than something like CBT or DBT, which have tons of research?
Right. The crucial question, what are the mechanics? And the entire engine of change in the Unity method is built on rejecting that old fixed brain idea. The absolute foundation is neuroplasticity. We simply know, it's not debated anymore, that the brain is not static. It physically changes its structure and function based on experience.
We know trauma can change it negatively.
Absolutely. Adverse experiences, trauma, chronic stress, they can literally wire the brain for hypervigilance, for shutdown, for dysregulation. We see those changes. But and this is the crucial but for Unity, the brain also changes in response to positive, corrective experiences. Things like secure relationships, feeling safe, mindfulness practices, targeted therapy, learning new skills, even love and connection.
So change isn't just a nice idea, it's biologically guaranteed if the conditions are right.
It's the brain's nature. The famous saying in neuroscience is, neurons that fire together wire together, Hebb's law. If past experiences wired certain pathways to fire easily into, say, fear or shame or collapse, then creating new experiences of safety, connection, regulation, self-compassion allows new neural pathways to form and strengthen, pathways leading towards balance, resilience, integration.
So healing isn't just managing old patterns, it's literally building new brain structures.
That's the potential. Change isn't just possible. The Unity model argues it's the brain's default tendency when it's given the right input, the right environment. Unity aims to be the structured, intentional delivery system for precisely that kind of corrective input.
Okay, so how does it deliver that? The prospectus outlines this framework, the 5 interlocking pillars. This seems like the real nuts and bolts. If we're pitching this as the next step in therapy, we need to understand what each pillar does.
Definitely. These 5 pillars work together. They're interconnected and designed to create that environment for neuroplastic change. Let's walk through them. Pillar 1 is wholeness over wounding. This is the guiding philosophy we've been talking about, but it's also an active therapeutic stance. It dictates how the therapist interacts, how they interpret the client's experience moment by moment. It means constantly, gently guiding the client away from identifying with the broken parts and towards recognizing their underlying wholeness and adaptive capacity.
So practically, if a client says, I'm just fundamentally broken, I can't stop thinking these catastrophic thoughts,
The Unity therapist might respond with something like, I hear how painful those thoughts are. And isn't it amazing how incredibly well-trained your brain became at anticipating potential danger based on what you went through? That's a sign of its incredible capacity for preparedness. Our work now is to help that brilliant brain learn that the level of preparedness needed back then might not match the safety you have access to right now.
So it's an active, constant reframe away from pathology language.
Yes. Refusing to collude with the identity of defect is a core therapeutic action in this pillar. It sets the stage.
Okay. Pillar 1 sets the philosophical compass. But we know from trauma research that a lot of this isn't just in our thoughts, right? It's deeper. Which brings us to Pillar 2. This feels like a major departure from purely talk-based therapies.
It is, and the sources emphasize this as absolutely essential, non-negotiable really. Pillar 2 is somatic restoration, soma meaning the body. This pillar explicitly draws on the work of giants in the field like Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score, and Peter Levine, who developed somatic experiencing.
Right, the idea that trauma lives in the body.
Exactly. Their crucial insight, backed by a lot of research now, is that traumatic memory isn't always stored like a neat story in our thinking brain. Often, it's stored subcortically lower down, in the brainstem, the limbic system, the nervous system itself. It lives there as physical sensations, muscle tension, shallow breathing, a racing heart, visceral feelings of dread or collapse, automatic reactions, patterns of fight, flight, freeze.
So just talking about it might not get to that level.
It often doesn't. If the trauma's primary imprint is physiological, purely cognitive or narrative approaches might only scratch the surface. The body, which holds the original traumatic charge, the unmet survival responses, needs to be directly involved in the healing. It needs to learn on a gut level that the danger has passed and it's safe now.
So what does somatic restoration actually look like in a therapy session? Is it like yoga?
It can incorporate mindful movement, but it's more specific. It uses bottom-up processing, starting with the body sensations to influence the brain, rather than top-down, mind-influencing body. This involves things like guided breathwork practices designed to calm the nervous system and improve heart rate variability, grounding techniques that bring awareness to the physical sensations of the body in the present moment, feeling your feet on the floor, the chair supporting you. Interoception exercises learning to notice and tolerate internal body states without being overwhelmed. Sometimes gentle, mindful movements that help the body process and release stored activation or tension, allowing it to complete those thwarted survival responses in a safe way.
So you're teaching the body safety, bypassing the thinking mind's defenses sometimes.
That's the goal, because until the nervous system genuinely feels safe, truly settles, trying to change core beliefs or rewrite narratives often feels like putting wallpaper on a crumbling wall. The foundation needs to be stable.
And that feeling of safety, as you mentioned earlier, isn't usually learned alone. It's often learned in relationship, which connects nicely to the next pillar.
Exactly. Pillar 3 is relational repatterning. This addresses the attachment dimension. Many, if not most, difficulties that bring people to therapy have roots in early attachment experiences, how we learn to connect or not connect with caregivers. Unity, again, reframes attachment wounds or disorders as attachment strategies, the best way someone learned to cope in their early relational environment.
So how does the therapy relationship help heal those old patterns?
The therapist actively works to provide what was missing. A consistently safe, attuned, regulated presence. This is where the concept of co-regulation comes in.
Co-regulation, meaning the therapist's calm nervous system helps regulate the client's dysregulated one.
Precisely. Just like a calm parent soothes a distressed infant, the therapist's steady, non-anxious, non-reactive presence acts as an external regulator for the client's system. Over time, the client's nervous system literally borrows that regulation and starts to learn it internally. This happens through the therapist's authentic witnessing, truly seeing and validating the client's experience without judgment, and sometimes through specific dyadic exercises that explore relational dynamics in the safety of the therapy room. The client's implicit nonverbal memory starts to learn, maybe for the first time, that closeness can be safe, vulnerability won't lead to abandonment, needing someone doesn't mean being engulfed. This slow, steady exposure to a secure base helps overwrite those old survival patterns that show up as, say, anxious clinging or fearful avoidance.
This is not just talking about relationships. The therapy relationship itself becomes the healing experience.
It's a primary mechanism of change. They are rewiring relational patterns in real time through lived experience.
Okay, wholeness, body, relationship. What's next?
Pillar 4 is neuroplastic empowerment. This is the psychoeducational piece. It's about giving clients the owner's manual for their own brain and nervous system. Clients learn the basics of relevant neuroscience. What's the amygdala's job in threat detection? How does the prefrontal cortex help with regulation? What is the vagus nerve and how does breathwork affect it? Crucially, they learn about neuroplasticity itself, that their brain can and does change.
So understanding the why behind the symptoms in the healing process.
Exactly. And this knowledge is incredibly empowering. It shifts the locus of control. Instead of feeling like a passive victim of, say, a chemical imbalance or a personality disorder, the client starts to understand, okay, my anxiety response is my amygdala doing its job based on past learning. My shutdown is my nervous system trying to protect me. These are processes I can influence.
It makes them an active participant in their own rewiring.
It restores hope and agency dramatically. They realize, if I practice these somatic tools, pillar 2, engage in this safe relationship, pillar 3, I am actively changing the input to my brain, and therefore I can change the output. That understanding fuels motivation and engagement.
Makes sense. And the final pillar, pillar 5.
Pillar 5 is acceptance over forgiveness. This one addresses a really common and sometimes harmful pressure placed on people who've been hurt, especially trauma survivors.
The pressure to forgive the person who harmed them.
Yes. While forgiveness can be a path for some, Unity argues that healing should not be contingent upon it. Forcing forgiveness before someone is ready or when it doesn't feel authentic can actually be re-traumatizing or invalidating. Instead, Unity emphasizes radical acceptance, which doesn't mean condoning harm. It means accepting the reality of what happened, the pain, the impact, accepting the feelings about it, even if they're messy or uncomfortable, accepting responsibility for one's own choices and healing path now, and crucially, accepting one's own inherent, unbroken wholeness despite what happened.
So the focus stays internal, on your own dignity and agency, rather than being dependent on your relationship with the perpetrator.
Precisely. Healing becomes anchored in self-compassion and personal empowerment, not in a potentially impossible demand related to the source of the harm.
Wow, okay. That's a really comprehensive framework. Wholeness, somatic work, relational healing, neuroeducation, acceptance. How do these all come together? What's the synthesis?
The culmination where all these pillars converge and integrate is in narrative reconstruction. This is where the client, guided by the therapist and supported by the safety built through the other pillars, begins to actively reauthor their core life story, their sense of self.
Moving from the broken story to the whole story.
Exactly. Using the language and understanding gained from the pillars. The shift often follows a progression, something like, from I am broken, I am my diagnosis, to I endured incredibly difficult things and my system adapted brilliantly to survive, to ultimately, I am inherently whole. My past experiences shaped me, but they don't define my core identity or my future potential. I am capable of healing and growth.
And this isn't just positive thinking.
Not at all. It's much deeper. Because we know from neuroscience that storytelling, narrative construction, is a powerful brain process. When you tell your story differently, when you truly start to internalize that new narrative of resilience and wholeness, it activates emotional networks, cognitive networks, and somatic networks simultaneously. You're feeling it, thinking it, and embodying it differently.
So changing the story actually helps rewire the brain.
That's the idea. By consciously reauthoring your narrative through this lens of wholeness and adaptive intelligence, you are actively participating in the neuroplastic process. The trauma, the struggles become integrated as part of your history, part of your journey, but they cease to be the defining feature of your identity. That's the transformation Unity aims for.
Okay, this philosophy, these mechanics, they sound incredibly compelling, deeply resonant. But now we hit the hard questions again. For this to genuinely be pitched as Therapy 2.0, potentially replacing models with decades of research, it needs proof, hard data. So let's address the skeptic listening right now. How does Unity propose to measure success differently? And what evidence, even if projected at this stage, suggests it could actually outperform established treatments like CBT or DBT?
A completely fair and necessary challenge, and the Unity prospectus tackles this head-on. They aren't just claiming a nicer philosophy, they're pitching empirical superiority. The core hypothesis they aim to test is bold. They predict that a therapeutic model like Unity, which fundamentally emphasizes inherent wholeness and actively rejects diagnostic labeling as identity, will produce significantly better outcomes in key areas compared to interventions rooted in a pathology-first framework.
Better outcomes not just in reducing symptoms, like fewer panic attacks or higher mood scores.
Right. While symptom reduction is important and tracked, Unity argues that's not the whole picture, maybe not even the most important part of deep healing. They focus on measuring the growth of core human capacities. Resiliency, agency.
So what specific tools are they using to measure that?
They use well-validated, standardized scales, but focus on ones that tap into these deeper capacities. First, the General Self-Efficacy Scale, GSES. This measures a person's fundamental belief in their own ability to handle challenges, to cope, to succeed. It's a direct measure of agency and predicts long-term well-being really well.
Okay, belief in oneself.
Second, the Difficulties in Emotion Regulation Scale, DUDERS. This goes beyond just counting, say, self-harm incidents. It assesses the person's internal experience. How aware are they of their emotions? Can they accept them? Can they access strategies to manage them effectively without resorting to harmful coping mechanisms? It measures the relationship with emotions.
Deeper than just symptom checklists.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And of course, they also track things like client satisfaction and the strength of the therapeutic alliance, because we know that relationship is key to any therapy working.
And then there's the unique measure, the one designed specifically to capture that identity shift we talked about.
Yes, this is what the Unity proponents see as the crucial differentiator in their research design. The Narrative Identity Scale, NIS. This scale is specifically developed to quantify that internal shift. It measures where someone falls on a spectrum from a pathology-centered identity, low scores indicating beliefs like, I am fundamentally flawed, my diagnosis defines me, towards a wholeness-centered identity, high scores reflecting beliefs like, I am whole despite my struggles, my potential defines me.
So it directly measures the success of Pillar 1, that reframing of identity.
And the culmination of all the pillars, yes. It tracks the restoration of dignity, which they argue is the ultimate goal of the whole movement.
Okay, let's get to the projections then. This is the data pitch. If Unity is claiming it can do better than therapies refined over decades, where are the biggest projected differences?
The anticipated results outlined in the prospectus are, frankly, quite dramatic, especially in those areas reflecting internal empowerment. Let's take self-efficacy, GSES. The projection is that participants in the Unity method will show gains nearly double those seen in control groups receiving standard CBT or DBT.
Double. That's huge. Why would that be?
The hypothesis is that when you directly address the internalized shame and hopelessness, Pillar 1, and empower the client with knowledge about their own capacity for change, Pillar 4, you restore core confidence and agency much more profoundly than if you primarily focus on teaching cognitive or behavioral coping skills alone. It rebuilds the foundation of self-belief.
Okay, that makes intuitive sense. What about for people really struggling with intense emotional states, the chaos, the numbness? What about emotional regulation?
On the duress emotional regulation, the projections are also striking. Unity participants are anticipated to reduce their scores, indicating significantly less difficulty with emotion regulation by almost half.
Wow, cutting dysregulation nearly in half.
Yes. And this is attributed largely to the integration of Pillar 2, somatic restoration. The argument is that combining deep body-based work to calm the physiological storm with narrative reconstruction to make sense of it leads to a much deeper, more embodied, more sustainable form of regulation than approaches that remain primarily cognitive or skills-focused.
So if you don't calm the body, the mind skills might not stick.
That's the contention. You need to address the trauma where it lives, which is often in the nervous system's activation patterns.
Okay, but the really groundbreaking claim seems to be around that identity piece, the NIS. That's where therapy 1.0 and 2.0 are projected to look fundamentally different.
Absolutely. This, according to the prospectus, highlights the difference between managing a condition and transforming one's relationship to it and to oneself. The projected data shows that while traditional models like CBT-DBT do help people, they show improvement on the NIS, maybe moving from a baseline score around a 2.5 up to about 5.4. They still often leave the person fundamentally identifying as someone managing a disorder. They learn to cope with feeling broken.
Okay, so some improvement, but maybe not a fundamental identity shift.
Right. Compare that to the Unity projections. Clients are expected to shift radically on the NIS. Starting from a similar baseline, around 2.3, they're projected to reach scores averaging 8.7.
Wow, 2.3 to 8.7. That's not just improvement, that's a different category.
It's a transformation from a pathology-centered identity to a solidly wholeness-centered one. It suggests Unity isn't just giving people tools, it's fundamentally changing their internal operating system, liberating them from the identity of their diagnosis.
Which really comes through in the qualitative data they expect to find, right? It's not just the numbers, but the words people use.
Exactly. The projected qualitative findings really crystallize the difference. They anticipate that clients from traditional models might say things like, I learned skills to manage my depression, or I use my worksheet when I feel anxious. They gained skills. Unity clients, on the other hand, are projected to say things more like, I realized I am whole, and my depression was actually my system's intelligent way of surviving back then. I don't need it in the same way now. Or, my anxiety was over-preparedness, now I'm learning safety. They gained a new identity.
One manages the problem self, the other realizes a whole self.
That's the core difference they're aiming to prove. People stop defining themselves by what went wrong and start defining themselves by their innate capacity to heal, adapt, and grow.
Okay, powerful stuff. One last practical point. For this to be a movement, not just a boutique therapy, it needs to be accessible, scalable. Is Unity tied to, expensive one-on-one sessions in a clinic?
No, and that's explicitly built into the model's design, according to the prospectus. Accessibility and scalability are key. While Unity is designed to be effective in traditional individual therapy settings, the principles and the 5 pillars are intentionally structured so they can be adapted and delivered effectively in various formats.
Like what?
Things like virtual therapy platforms, structured group programs focusing on psychoeducation and somatic skills, even intensive workshops or immersive retreats. This flexibility is crucial. It means the approach isn't limited by setting, allowing for broader reach and potentially impacting the wider cultural conversation about mental health, not just remaining within the confines of high-cost clinical care.
Okay. So bringing this all together, if these projections, this data bear out, this really is positioned as much more than just another therapeutic technique on the menu. It sounds like a genuine call for a cultural shift in how we understand suffering, healing, and human potential itself.
That is absolutely the takeaway the creators intend. Unity isn't being presented as just one more tool in the toolbox. It's positioning itself as the next necessary evolution in therapy. The evolution that aims to resolve the unintended brokenness crisis, arguably fostered by the very systems designed to help. It sees itself as the much-needed bridge between the rigor of modern science, like neuroplasticity, somatic processing, and the profound, maybe more spiritual or philosophical truth of inherent human dignity.
So it's not just another modality.
The argument is, the field doesn't just need one more acronym. It needs an approach that fundamentally reframes the entire field, that changes the starting point from deficit to wholeness.
It really sounds like it's carrying 2 huge missions at the same time.
It is, explicitly. The prospectus outlines this dual mission. First, the clinical mission: to rigorously prove its effectiveness through research, to generate the data, and to establish Unity as a recognized, evidence-based approach within the therapeutic canon, just like CBT or DBT or EMDR are now. That's the scientific validation piece.
Okay, prove it works clinically.
Second, and perhaps even more ambitiously, the humanitarian mission: to actively work to dismantle that psychological cage of diagnostic identity we talked about, to restore dignity to people seeking help by changing the language, changing the focus, and consistently reintroducing them to their own innate wholeness and resilience.
So the data serves the philosophy, and the philosophy drives a larger movement.
Exactly. The clinical mission provides the credibility. The humanitarian mission provides the purpose, the why.
It really is framed as a radical invitation, then. An invitation for us, for you listening, to perhaps question that deeply ingrained cultural narrative of brokenness, to reject the idea that your struggles define your core identity, instead to consider participating in this shift, moving how we all think about mental health, away from broken people needing fixing, towards whole people healing, adapting, and growing.
And that leaves us with a final thought, a provocative question perhaps for you to mull over based on everything we've explored today. If trauma, if adversity can be powerful enough to teach your nervous system, your body, your entire being how to adapt and survive, sometimes through states of intense chaos or fear or shut down, just imagine what new, brilliant, powerful, and whole adaptation is your system waiting to learn, ready to embody, when you finally give your body, your nervous system, and your unique story the consistent experience, the deep knowing of feeling truly, fundamentally safe.